Czym różni się strach od lęku? Czy jesteśmy w stanie wzbić się ponad ten lęk i co by się stało, gdybyśmy całkowicie ze swojego życia pozbyli się strachu? O tym i o wielu innych aspektach lęku, strachu porozmawiam z moim i Państwa dzisiejszym gościem, profesorem Stefanem Hofmannem, wybitnym psychologiem i badaczem. To jest podcast, który być może kiedyś już słyszeliście, ale nie zaszkodzi go posłuchać raz jeszcze. Ja nazywam się Joanna Gutral, jestem psycholożką i psychoterapeutką poznawczo-behawioralną, a to jest mój podcast, w którym gadam. Podcast, który mogę realizować dzięki wsparciu miłościwie mi groszem sypiących patronów i patronek. Bardzo serdecznie Wam za to dziękuję, a Was zapraszam do wysłuchania rozmowy z profesorem Stefanem Hofmannem, autorem książki Ponad lękiem, która ukazała się w Polsce nakładem gdańskiego wydawnictwa psychologicznego. Dodam tylko, że rozmowa realizowana jest w języku angielskim, a tłumaczenie tej rozmowy znajdziecie na moim blogu www.joannagutral.pl. Zapraszam. So, today we are talking with Professor Stefan Hofmann, clinical psychologist at the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Boston University. He is one of the foremost experts in cognitive behavioral therapy, especially for anxiety disorders. Hello, Professor. Thank you for finding time for us today. So we will talk today about your book that has just been published here in Poland, the Anxiety Skills Workbook, in Polish, Ponad lękiem. Have you seen your book here in Poland? Like the cover looks like, what the title is?
No, I have not. Looks good.
You have not. In Polish, Ponad lękiem, published by gdańskie wydawnictwo psychologiczne. But let me show you something first. Do you recognize this book? This is the process-based CBT book you wrote with Professor Hayes, who already interviewed in our podcast, by the way. And you came to Poland last year exactly a year ago to give a lecture about emotional regulation, and the pandemic here started and we couldn't attend the lecture. Luckily, it is recorded and available on YouTube. But I got this book from the publisher, asked Professor Agnieszka Popiel and Dr. Ewa Pragłowska for your signature, and here it is. Exactly. Yeah, I was supposed to be on that lecture and I couldn't attend because of the pandemic that has just started. So, Joanna, you signed the book for a year ago. It's me. Glad we have a chance to chat a year later. And it was quite an unusual year.
It has been. It's still going on. The craziness is still going on.
So what are we facing? Is it fear or is it an anxiety?
It's both. So the difference between fear and anxiety is fear is an emotion that arises when you're confronted with immediate threat. So when you are, it is a natural response to your body when you believe that you're in danger, psychologically or physically. And anxiety is a emotional state. It's not a pure emotion, but rather an emotional state that is future oriented. That is sort of it's very cognitively mediated. You engage in a lot of worrying and thinking and about planning ahead. And part of what makes the situation we're in right now anxiety provoking or anxiety inducing is obviously that there's so much uncertainty, there's so much uncontrollability, there's so much unpredictability. So whenever we are in this state of we're not sure what's going to happen, it might not be good. That's what when anxiety arises. It is not the same as fear. Fear, both are natural responses when both emotional experiences, though, are excessive and interfering with people's lives. That's when we have problems. The question now is this now excessive, what we're experiencing? Well, no, it's not. It is a fairly natural response to something unprecedented, something that we have not confronted in our life. Most of us in our lifetime, some very old people have experienced something similar. And people from other countries are quite familiar with that. The Ebola crisis in Africa, as an example. So this global pandemic, though, is a new experience for most generations. We are taught to stay away from each other, to socially isolate. We are taught that this is dangerous to contract the virus, even though there's a political movement that runs against it. Some people think that this is a political issue, and they refuse to wear masks and have wild ideas about why social distancing and other measures are in place to protect ourselves and others. So this it's unfortunate. This is very much of a political issue. It really shouldn't be. And the pandemic could have been controlled very easily and quickly if people had just come to their senses and would have implemented some of these measures early on. Now we are, we have to wait for the vaccine to be effective and continue that. But eventually, the situation will resolve, and we will come back to some sort of sense of normality. Again, when this is going to happen exactly, we're not sure. So for that reason, anxiety continues and persists. Some people respond to it differently than others. It's not to say that anxiety disorders are not on the rise. They are. And it's not to say that the pandemic is not also responsible. Absolutely it is. People have different ways of dealing with that. It's not as though there's likely an influx of depression, anxiety, and stress-related problems. As a result of the pandemic, there will be a plateau, and then we'll go down to what we are usually expecting. There will be a surge. There will be a wave of mental health problems that are caused by the pandemic.
That's my next question. Well, first of all, I wanted to talk about what exactly anxiety disorders are. And the second question was, is pandemic or the current situation a triggering factor that can, start and, for example, general anxiety disorder, or how it influences people with social anxiety right now, where we are actually supposed to distance from each other?
So anxiety disorders as a mental disorder is very, very common. It's one of the most common group of disorders that there is. Other common disorders are depression, mood disorders, major depression, bipolar, and the like, and substance use problems. So anxiety is and interestingly, all three are prevalent now, because people also abuse alcohol and other drugs, and they feel very depressed, and also anxiety is on the rise. The group of anxiety disorders as a whole is the most prevalent, and then we categorize these people with anxiety disorders. You mentioned two: generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder are examples. There's also specific phobia. These are fears, excessive fears of situations, objects, etc., such as spiders or snakes, or dogs, etc. There is acute stress disorder. There's we have also the whole trauma group is post-traumatic stress disorder and the like. They're also linked to obviously anxiety. We have we used to include obsessive compulsive disorder in this large group. This is now part of a separate category called obsessive compulsive spectrum disorder. We have adjustment disorder, people who have problems adjusting to new environments. We have other subforms of anxiety, but you mentioned the most common ones already. Then there's also panic disorder and agoraphobia. These are also very well-researched disorders. These are excessive fears for no apparent reason that hit you out of the blue, and people avoid things, going to places, going out to supermarket and the like. So there's a broad spectrum of forms of anxiety disorders. The book that I wrote was primarily focused on people with this heightened level of anxiety called generalized anxiety disorder. I've also spent most of my adult life researching social anxiety disorder as well, so I could also speak to that. And also other forms of anxiety, obviously, as well. But the book that you have is primarily focused on generalized anxiety disorder, which is linked to excessive worrying. Kind of these are negative, repetitive cognitive activities, future-oriented. That is, however, not problem-solving, but rather it puts you in a loop, as if it's, if you're not old enough to know what these kind of record players are. These are prior to the iPhone. Prior to that was a CD player. Prior to that were these records that you put on, these massive big things, and sometimes they get stuck. It's just the needle wouldn't move forward, and you just hear the same a piece of the music over and over again. That's worrying. That's sort of being stuck in a loop, not proceeding, not being able to come to a solution or to resolve to resolution. It's simply a problem-solving attempt going awry. And people who worry a lot, they believe somehow that worrying has some sort of it's somehow helpful because it protects them from that horrible thing but it's not quite clear what they're actually worrying. It's often, they worry a lot of things. They have this heightened sense of this looming sense of danger that is always out there. And by worrying somehow they would avoid this whatever unspecified danger there is. So these people have lived in a constant state of tension and worrying, and it can be very distressing and interfering with people's lives.
I need to say, I don't know if it's a correct thing to say, but general anxiety disorder is one of my favorite disorders, because when I was studying many years ago, I realized hey, I have this model, it sounds like me. I have so many positive beliefs about being worried. I can predict the future and I can protect myself from unexpected events that might occur on my way. So is being worried, or is worries all the way bad, or it can be sometimes somehow useful for us?
It really depends on how we define the term. The way I define it in the book and the way I would define it with my clients is worrying is never, ever good. Worrying is always bad. Planning ahead, problem solving, that's positive, that's adaptive, that's useful. But worrying, and we define worrying as a problem solving attempt going awry, kind of a negative cognitive attempt that gets stuck in this loop. So it's similar to this record player. Well, is it good to hear sometimes the same segment of the music over and over and over again? Who would enjoy that? No, it is never good. In the same way, worrying is never good.
This is the most common question that we have from our followers and people who are listening to our podcast. Is when is the good time to go to psychotherapist? How can I measure if I am worrying too much, or is it not enough yet to get and seek for help?
I would think if you have to start asking yourself this question, you probably have already passed that limit, and you should probably have gone already. So it's, I think we need to destigmatize also looking for help, and there's nothing wrong with going to a therapist, not even knowing if you have a problem. There's nothing wrong. There are people who make a career calling themselves life coaches and just talking to people. Talking to people is always good. Even if you want to talk to a friend, you don't have to call it therapy, but talking about issues that concern you is never a bad idea. If you then happen to pay this person some money, well, then, and you can afford it, then go ahead and do that. You call it then therapy, fine, call it therapy if you want. Not to say that just talking is the same as therapy. It's not. So if you now have problems significant enough that actually really distresses you and interferes with your life, that it feels like it gets in the way. It feels like you can't move ahead, you can't reach what you want to reach, you can't come closer to your goals. Or even if other people say, like, you're not the same anymore, it's difficult to be around you. All of these are really good indicators that you really now should look for professional help. Professional help are people who are trained in dealing with these problems. These are licensed clinicians who are trained in how to approach this. So now just talking is not enough. It always helps to talk. It's never a bad idea. But in this case now, you need specific techniques to do that. And some of these techniques that I've been discussing that in the book, translating that also for individuals who maybe don't feel comfortable going to a client or want to try it first to deal with it themselves. So for those people, this book is tailored. But basically, a very good therapist, not a very good therapist, a competent therapist would know all of these things and would approach that in exactly the same way or very similar way. That means that you tailor that to the client. You need to know that's not all same size fits all kind of approach, and is also you want to understand what the individual problem is, and but then the specific strategies, and some again are outlined in the book, such as worry postponement, cognitive, metacognitive strategies, mindfulness, and attention training. All of these things are very effective strategies and not all of them for all people, but some components very effective for some people, and those you need to apply.
I like this book because it can be a great self-help book, but also very good to include as a part of the therapy. But I also like being a devil advocate in conversations like that. So I'm going to ask you one of those questions, like, is it not just easier to avoid things that we are anxious about? Just pretend that they do not exist and do not leave your house.
The natural response is anxiety often leads to avoidance. The problem is that you're restricting your life. You are not living your life to its fullest, and avoidance tends to be the main reason why people eventually then look for help, because anxiety becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and your lived life becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So avoidance is in a way your anxiety's best friend. It sort of anxiety can't maintain and can't survive without you avoiding. Avoiding is sort of feeding anxiety. It makes it's the water and the nutrients that for the anxiety tree to grow, and it grows further and further and further. So one very effective strategy to deal with anxiety, with any form of anxiety, is stop avoiding. Is confronting your fears and anxieties, and that's also outlined in the book.
How can I face it? There are so many terrible things waiting for me. I can see the whole catastrophe waiting, and you want just me to go and face it? Like, that doesn't sound helpful.
Give me an example. What's one of them? What's one of those examples that is so?
Okay, I'm talking to you right now. I'm not a native English speaker. I'm kind of worried about my English, and I'm constantly thinking that you're going to laugh at me and just end this interview saying, like, you are too dumb to talk to me. Bye-bye. I'm very anxious about it right now.
Here involved. One is your English is actually quite good, and we are communicating right now. We've been doing that for quite some time already. Second, let's assume that this is correct. Let's assume for a second now that you were making mistakes, and let's even assume that I would find it funny. What would be so horrible about it?
No, you will laugh at me. I will never make any other interview in my entire life. My career will be over, and I'll be lying in bed all day till the end of my life.
And do I really need to pursue this questioning further, or do you already see the absurdity of the answers yourself?
Yes, I already see the absurd of this. And I understand that, you can see the absurd, but then it's easier to think than actually doing. So how can we help people do the things they are being scared of, they are being worried about?
Exactly what you're saying. Rather than saying things, you actually need to be doing things. That's the critical, probably one of the most critical differences between a late-term therapy and sort of having insight, a friend telling you the right things and giving you advice, to the therapist who actually guides you, even though your friend might have the same insight as a therapist, or the therapist would guide you to action. You need to do that. Therapy is an active process. It's not just having insight and understanding things, but rather you need to turn that into concrete actions. You need to try it out. You need to expose yourself and experience it and see what happens.
What are the reasons?
The problem is, if you're wrong, you give anxiety too much power in your life. And anxiety will guide you in what you can do. If you give in, then you lose. That's the trouble. It's not to say that you need, in a way, I want you to become cognizant of reality, of being approaching this in an adaptive way. If there is a pandemic, going back to the pandemic, so should we treat people who are fearful of the virus just going out without a mask and exposing themselves in a big crowd, maybe even joining the crowd that stormed Congress and yelling at people? No, because it's not adaptive to do that. This is actually real danger. You need to distinguish when something is rationally dangerous and when you believe it's to be dangerous, but it's really not. So yes, you should wear a mask or be vaccinated and avoid crowds because it is really dangerous. That's why we're saying that. It would be stupid to expose yourself. Now, but if you now avoid crowds because you're afraid of contracting HIV of people, which some at the very beginning of the HIV epidemic actually did happen. People were avoiding touching people, and because people didn't know how the HIV virus partly transmitted. But there's still crazy people out there who don't want to be around gays because they're afraid to. So this is nonsensical because there is no real danger. You cannot contract virus by touching people, hugging people, or even kissing people. Okay, so that is. Reality should matter. What is the truth should matter. So you need to align your beliefs with the world. If your beliefs distort your perception of the world, then you need to adjust your beliefs because your beliefs should be in line with what the world looks like. And so you need to change the way you perceive things and in a way also change the way you think because it should match reality.
What are the reasons why some people struggle with anxiety disorder? Is it biological? Is it the way we were born and raised?
Yeah, all of the above. There's problems, all mental health problems. It's not unique to anxiety disorders. We call them multi-causal. Multifactorial. Many things are involved in it, not in the same way for all people, but genetics are important. We know other biological issues are important. There's certain brain circuitries certain brain structures that might be overactive in some and others. Certain connections in the brain. Certain hormones are important. Males and females are different in their response. Upbringing is very important. The connectedness with others is essential. What you learn as you grow older, your cultural setting, what is adaptive, what is maladaptive, depends on the broader cultural context. All of these things matter, and it obviously gives us a lot of opportunity to do a lot of research to figure out which is more important for some people than others. For that reason, we created this idea of process-based therapy, that we are trying to incorporate all of these possible factors, but then focus on the individual, not pooling everybody in one group and saying, oh, it's this gene. Well, no, you'll never find this one gene that predicts, oh, it's this thought that people have. No, it's also not true. It's never this one thought that everybody has, but rather we need to figure out what is true for the individual and figure out how these things are connected.
We also got a couple questions from our followers because they are highly interested in subjects like general anxiety disorder, dealing with panic attacks, phobia, and so on. So we announced that we're going to talk to you, so they had an opportunity to ask some questions. And the question that occurred the most was, are anxiety disorder, especially generalized anxiety disorder, fully curable? I mean, is it possible to get rid of it forever?
So anxiety should never be something that you want to get rid of. Anxiety is an adaptive, fear more so. Anxiety as well is an adaptive response to, in case of fear, to present danger, in case of anxiety, to anticipated danger. That's, you can never, if you don't have anxiety, you will have a big problem. There are people who are unable to feel fear and anxiety, by the way. They have neurological problems, neurological disorders. In children, when they do not show separation anxiety, stranger anxiety, the pediatrician knows that there's something very seriously wrong with this child. And so to say that curing means getting rid of anxiety, that would be nonsensical. No, that is not what you want to achieve. What you want to achieve is living with your anxiety, experiencing it in situations where it makes sense, and not experiencing it in situations where it doesn't make sense. Maybe also turning anxiety into activation, into something positive. When people, perform in front of others, the goal is not necessarily not to feel non-anxious, but rather turning this activation that you have into something beautiful, maybe playing a musical instrument or playing in the Olympics or whatever, and achieving a level of performance that you otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve if you didn't have this activation. Anxiety simply activates you. What you make with this activation, how you channel that is the trick. And if you turn it inwardly, beating yourself up and putting yourself down and trying to avoid, that's not adaptive.
Are anxiety disorders hereditary?
Heritable. Yes, they are. Again, genes do matter. And some problems are more heritable than others. Even PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that people have after being exposed to trauma, is heritable. We know that through twin studies. So it's more of a vulnerability, meaning a diaphysis, meaning a predisposition to develop an anxiety that's being inherited, but not the anxiety disorder itself. But there's some genetic component to all of them. But what we're looking at now, research is looking at, is the question: what is it that actually is sort of genetically driven? We know that a particular factor called anxiety sensitivity is one such vulnerability factor that is more linked to the genes than other things. By the way, we call it also endophenotype sometimes. These are things that are closer to the genes than actually the visible symptoms. So rather than counting the DSM or ICD criteria and assuming that they are somehow heritable, but it's something that is driving these symptoms, if you will, that is closer to the gene, such as maybe neuroticism or anxiety sensitivity, or even hyperactivity of the amygdala, or increased cortisol release during a stress response, or distress tolerance. All of these things are often dimensional, and there's what we call endophenotypes sometimes.
How about observing others and learning? Like, as I mentioned, my mom was being worried all the time. My grandma, everyone around me believed that being worried can protect me. Is it possible to influence that way of thinking by being raised by people who are highly anxious?
Absolutely, yes. So genes matter, but also upbringing matters. And some people argue that it's the upbringing that matters more. It's to make things even more complicated. The interaction between upbringing and genes matter, and to make things even more complicated, the genes that turn on and off depending on your environmental stress matter. This is called epigenetics. And so, if you are if you experience horrific trauma during your lifetime, certain genes might be silenced, others turn on as a result. Not all of our genes are expressed. And interestingly, you actually turn this code, if you will, over to your offspring and those and the offspring of your offspring. So trauma, in a way, transmits through generations through something called epigenetics. This is something that is now very exciting in our field of research, because it breaks down sort of this distinction, heredity and environment. We know that there has always been the interaction, but now that actually the environment somehow is integrated into the genes, that opens up a whole new world of research.
Can anxiety go along with depression? Is it possible to deal with anxiety and depression in the same time?
It is highly associated. In fact, many people would argue, and there has been it's called comorbidity. That means that the different diagnoses are co-occur in the same individual. This is the rule rather than the exception. Comorbidity is the rule. You rarely find people who only have one problem. Why it is? Again, there's these dimensions that drive a lot. Anxiety, depression in particular, is highly comorbid. There's some anxiety disorders even more so, especially social anxiety disorder. The most common additional diagnosis is, in fact, depression. Why that is? Well, many reasons. There could be the underlying problem that gives rise to both. It could also be that the anxiety, having anxiety, makes you depressed. And who would not be depressed if you have limited social interactions and can't achieve what you want to achieve. We know that if you treat one, you typically also improve the other. And you want to treat whatever is most distressing first, and then to examine what it does to what seems to follow.
Is it possible to deal with anxiety disorders without any meds? I mean, just with the therapy?
Absolutely. It's not to say that there's not a single treatment that should be the only thing for people. We want to have a range of options, and for some, I would, coming from my orientation office and from my background, I would advise you to first see if psychotherapy works for you. Effective, empirically supported strategies, not any kind of therapy. I mean, it's not, again, as I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with talking to people, but you want to address these problems directly using psychotherapeutic approaches. And if this And sometimes you might need to add medication or perhaps even replace certain strategies with medication, depending on your individual problem. There's no one single approach for all problems.
What type of therapy is the most effective? I know that the answer is very simple.
The most effective form of therapy when you want to label something is called cognitive behavioral therapy. This has, however, is now a very broad umbrella term that incorporates many different strategies. It's not just focused on behaviors, not just focused on cognitions, but we also focus very heavily on, obviously, emotions, on self-related issues, on attentional processes and the like. But cognitive behavioral therapy, by far the most efficacious form for virtually any mental disorder.
There was one question that was very interesting for me from our followers. Is there any relationship between anxiety and anger, especially if we don't feel we should show or share our anger and we keep it closed for a really, really long time?
Yes, anger is very closely linked to anxiety. We observe even in individuals with social anxieties, or let's say who you would be surprised that anger has any involvement, because they are so concerned about other people's evaluation and want to appease and want to please everybody. We find a very robust subgroup of people who are just very angry people, and that is often expressed. That social anxiety, in a way, is both a cause and a result of that anger, and you need to target that in treatment. You cannot ignore that. Anger and aggression is obviously an externally, outwardly directed emotion, versus anxiety, depression, the more internally directed. So in children, make this distinction between externalizing and internalizing disorders for that reason. But this is still an emotion that is it's a behavior linked to a particular emotion that needs to be addressed. We also know that trauma is very closely linked to anger, and when people are highly traumatized, they not only feel extreme fear and startle a lot, but often their relationships break down because they have these anger outbursts. And what links those two is obviously the uncontrollability of regulating emotions. That emotions are out of control, and our system is no longer able to quiet down our emotions.
I just thought that I liked the title of the book, The Anxiety Skills, that you can actually manage your anxiety by using a certain type of skills you can get, not getting rid of the anxiety at all, which, as you mentioned, is not going to be beneficial. Who would benefit from your book the most? Who is it dedicated to? People do not know what their diagnosis is before they will get to the specialist. So if someone is thinking, is it a book for me or is it not? Who is it dedicated for?
People who are willing to try it out and to see if it can help them, but who are motivated enough to actually stick to it and go through that. It's not for people who are not quite sure if they want to spend any time on that and want to have a quick fix. It requires some commitment and sticking to it. We wrote it in a way that can be understood. This sort of an 8th grade level reading level. So it's obviously most people would be able to follow that very clearly. But I would say if there's a group that might not be overly benefit from it, is people who are severely cognitively impaired, who kind of have a hard time understanding things. And you know, that would I would advise. So I wouldn't give it to as a parent. I wouldn't give it to a severely mentally disabled son or daughter, assuming that they can read through that without problems. I would advise them to look for professional help.
So if we want to encourage people to get some little insight of the book, which one is your favorite? Which technique is your favorite that you described in the book?
See, that's number one. I would have to tell you who my most favorite son is. I wouldn't want to do that either. And also, there's no one size fits all. That's the whole idea, that we have different modules for different problems in this, and not a single person is identical to another person. That's why we all look different. That's why we can recognize faces. This is one person, this is the other person. We don't have even twins are not identical because they have slight differences. So it's impossible to do that. There's some strategies fit some people better than others.
Thank you for finding time for us today. We were talking with Professor Stefan Hofmann. Thank you very much for being with us, and I highly encourage you to look at the book Ponad, lękiem, the Anxiety Skills Workbook here in Poland, published by Gdańskie Wydawnictwo Psychologiczne. Thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure, Joanne.